Trusting in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't just mean trusting in His power, but it also means trusting in His wisdom. And sometimes that's a lot harder to do with your dua. So sometimes you might feel like you know exactly what you want and you're looking for the perfect way to ask for it. But part of that relationship of trust with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that you actually want Him to give you what's best for you, even if that contradicts what you so desperately are asking for initially. Jabir ibn Abdullah radiallahu ta'ala anhuma is a young man who struggled immensely in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His father is killed in Uhud, and Jabir radiallahu ta'ala anhu is left with a whole bunch of debt and 7 sisters to take care of. And he's the one who narrates this hadith about the most famous decision-making dua in Islam, which is known as dua al-Istikharah. And he says, كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يعلمنا الاستخارة في الأمور كالسورة من القرآن. That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to teach us to make istikhara with all of our affairs in the same way that he would teach us the Quran. Now, obviously, if you're reading that, you know that this means that istikhara is very important, but there's a specific messaging here. Just like you resort to the Quran, just like the Quran has guidance in all affairs of your life, just like you have the repetition of the Quran, just like you have the precise wording of the Quran, you have Salatul Istikhara. And Imam Ibn Raslan al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, he says that what's implied here is that you don't change any of the words of this dua. You don't add to it, you don't take away from it. You say it exactly as the Prophet ﷺ taught it, in the same way that you recite the Quran. And he says that clearly there is blessing in the specific wording that the Prophet ﷺ is using in Salatul Istikhara. And Imam Ibn Battal rahimahullah says the other implied meaning of this is that it is not befitting for the believer to rush into any matter, minor or major, until they first seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance. And so istikhara is not just for some major decision in your life, meaning it's not just for marriage and it's not just for trying to get into a particular program. It is for every single element of your life, and that is the relationship of dependence that you have upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says something deeply profound. He says, so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is showing us that the relationship of istikhara to the affairs of our lives is like the relationship of Quran to salah, the relationship of the recitation of Quran to every prayer. So basically, life without reciting istikhara is like salah without the recitation of the Quran. That's how important this dua was to the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what is istikhara and what isn't istikhara? So first and foremost, istikhara is not a magic pill. It's not something that suddenly clears the fog and gives you all sorts of clarity and opens the pathways for you. It's also not a dream, and this is probably the hardest thing for people to come to terms with. If you're trying to get married to someone and you pray istikhara and you see them in a dream, it's probably because you really want to marry that person, not because of the istikhara. Istikhara is not necessarily connected to your dreams. It's a dua for guidance, not something that shows up. There are no colors that you see at night that indicate yes or no. There's no such thing as an istikhara fairy. Yes, I've actually heard some cultures where you put yes and no under your pillow and you make dua and then you pick one of the pieces of paper and see which one it shows up as. That's just our desire to always get the direct answer that we're seeking from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But part of our dependence upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving the process to Him and giving the outcome to Him. And so istikhara is actually asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide you to the right way after you have done everything in your power, in your capacity to find the right way. So basically, after you've done your own homework and you've covered 2 other bases of decision making, you come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the final blessing. What does that mean? First and foremost, you exert your own efforts and your own thinking to see if this is good for you in your deen and your dunya. Secondly, you consult righteous people. You seek consultation. You do istishara, which is seeking people's advice to see if this is really the best thing for you in your deen or your dunya. And then you go to